The morning mist clung to the Irish coast like a funeral shroud. Sister Bridget had risen before dawn to tend the monastery gardens, her calloused hands working the soil that had fed her community for 7 peaceful years. The bells of Rathlin Abbey would ring for morning prayers in another hour, calling the faithful to worship as they had every day since her childhood. She pulled weeds from between the turnip rows, humming a psalm her mother had taught her decades ago. Then she heard the sound that would haunt her dreams forever, the scrape of wood against stone, the splash of oars cutting through morning water, voices speaking in a tongue that sounded like gravel grinding against steel. When she looked up from the garden, her blood turned to ice water in her veins. 3 longships had appeared from nowhere, sliding up onto the rocky beach like predators emerging from the depths. Warriors poured over the sides, their axes catching the first rays of sunlight. They moved with the practiced efficiency of men who had done this countless times before. Some headed for the abbey gates, others spread out to surround the entire compound. A few began dragging something from the ships: iron chains, rope, wooden cages barely large enough for a human being to crouch inside. Sister Bridget understood in that terrible moment that these weren't just raiders come for gold and silver. The preparation, the coordination, the specialized equipment they carried told a different story. These men had come harvesting, and she knew exactly what crop they intended to reap. What happened next at Rathlin Abbey in the year 847 would be repeated at hundreds of monasteries, villages and settlements across medieval Europe. The Vikings weren't just warriors seeking glory in battle. They weren't just explorers pushing the boundaries of the known world. They were participants in something far darker, far more systematic, and far more profitable than most history books dare to acknowledge. They were the architects of medieval Europe's most sophisticated human trafficking operation. For 3 centuries, from roughly 793 to 1100, Viking raiders perfected an industrial-scale system for capturing, processing, and selling human beings. Women and children were the primary targets, selected with the same calculated precision that modern corporations use to identify profitable market segments. What the Vikings created wasn't random violence or opportunistic pillaging. It was a continent-spanning network of human commerce that generated wealth on a scale that wouldn't be matched until the Atlantic slave trade 700 years later. The numbers alone tell a staggering story. Conservative estimates suggest that during the height of the Viking Age, over 500,000 people were enslaved by Norse raiders and traders. But these weren't just statistics in some distant historical ledger. Each number represented someone's daughter, someone's sister, someone's mother. Each represented a life torn apart, a family destroyed, a future erased by systematic brutality disguised as cultural expansion. Modern DNA studies reveal the genetic shadow this trafficking operation cast across Northern Europe. In Iceland, while male lineage is predominantly Scandinavian, female lineage is overwhelmingly Celtic. These percentages don't represent voluntary migration or peaceful cultural exchange. They represent the systematic abduction of women on a scale so vast it permanently altered the genetic structure of entire populations. Iceland was literally built on stolen women. But here's what makes this story particularly chilling. The Vikings didn't stumble into human trafficking as some accidental byproduct of their raids. They developed it deliberately, refining their techniques over generations until they had created the medieval world's most efficient system for turning human suffering into economic profit. They established permanent slave markets in Dublin, Hedeby, and Novgorod that operated with the organizational sophistication of modern distribution centers. They created legal frameworks that stripped enslaved people of every vestige of humanity while protecting the property rights of their captors. They developed specialized ships, standardized pricing systems, and international trade networks that moved human cargo from the Atlantic coast of Ireland to the markets of Baghdad. The scale of this operation required unprecedented levels of coordination. Viking raiders didn't just randomly attack whatever settlements they encountered. They gathered intelligence about population centers, studied seasonal patterns of agricultural work, and timed their strikes to maximize the number of people they could capture while minimizing resistance. They knew which ethnic groups commanded premium prices in which markets. They understood that Frankish women brought good money in Ireland, Irish women were valued in Iceland, and Slavic women commanded the highest prices in Byzantine territories. This wasn't amateur hour pillaging. This was industrial-scale human harvesting, conducted with the efficiency of a modern corporation and the ruthlessness of a military operation. The Vikings had turned human misery into their primary economic engine, and they were extraordinarily good at it. The evidence for this systematic approach exists in archaeological sites across Scandinavia. Excavations at major Viking trading centres reveal holding pens designed to house hundreds of people, specialised shackles manufactured in standardised sizes, and mass burial sites containing the remains of those who didn't survive the selection and processing procedures. These weren't makeshift prison camps thrown together for occasional use. They were permanent infrastructure investments designed to support ongoing commercial operations. The legal codes that governed Viking society provide even more disturbing evidence of how thoroughly human trafficking had been integrated into their culture. The Gragas laws of Iceland, preserved in remarkable detail, contain elaborate regulations governing every aspect of slave ownership. These weren't simple property laws adapted for human beings. They were comprehensive legal frameworks specifically designed to address the complexities of owning, using, breeding, and disposing of human property. Under these laws, enslaved women had no legal existence as persons. They couldn't own property, couldn't bear witness in legal proceedings, couldn't seek compensation for any harm done to them, and couldn't refuse any use of their bodies their owners demanded. Their children automatically inherited their enslaved status, regardless of who had fathered them. Even if a free man acknowledged paternity and wanted to claim his child, the law was absolute. Freedom could not be inherited through fathers. Slavery passed through mothers like a genetic curse, but the legal framework went far beyond simple ownership. It created an entire economy based on female reproductive capacity. Women were classified not just as general labourers, but as breeding stock whose primary value lay in their ability to produce more slaves. The laws contained detailed provisions for lending female slaves to guests as hospitality gestures, for calculating compensation when borrowed slaves became pregnant, and for determining ownership of children born from such arrangements. This wasn't slavery as ancient Rome had practiced it, where individuals might earn or purchase their freedom and integration into society was theoretically possible. This was something more systematic, more permanent, more designed to ensure that escape was not just difficult, but literally impossible. The Vikings had created a form of hereditary bondage that was intended to last forever. The religious and cultural justifications they developed for this system reveal how completely they had normalized human trafficking within their worldview. The Norse concept of fate suggested that some people were simply born to serve others. Their mythology portrayed slavery as part of the natural order established by the gods themselves. Slaves who died in service to their masters were sometimes buried with them, expected to continue their servitude in the afterlife. Even death didn't bring freedom from Viking bondage. This cultural acceptance of permanent human bondage created a society where the most horrific violations of human dignity were not just tolerated, but celebrated as demonstrations of wealth and power. Viking chieftains competed to see who could afford the most elaborate funeral sacrifices, which often included burning enslaved women alive on funeral pyres. These weren't considered murders, but religious ceremonies that supposedly honoured both the dead chieftain and the women selected to serve him in the next world. The women themselves had no choice in these matters. Historical accounts describe the systematic preparation of sacrificial victims, who were kept intoxicated for days before their deaths to ensure compliance. They were passed among the dead chieftain's warriors as a final service before being strangled and stabbed to guarantee their deaths. Witnesses describe these ceremonies as joyous occasions where the community celebrated their chieftain's power and wealth. The women's terror and suffering were irrelevant, except as proof of their owner's total dominion over life and death. What made this system particularly insidious was how it created multiple layers of trauma that compounded across generations. Women who survived the initial capture and transport faced years or decades of systematic violation and exploitation. Their children, born into slavery, knew no other existence and often internalized their status as property. Grandchildren and great-grandchildren grew up in families where freedom was not just absent, but literally unimaginable. The psychological damage from this multi-generational bondage created behavioral patterns that archaeologists and historians can still identify in the archaeological record. Enslaved populations showed signs of chronic malnutrition, repetitive stress injuries from forced labor, and bone damage consistent with frequent beatings. But they also showed evidence of more subtle forms of damage. Burial patterns suggest that enslaved families rarely stayed together for extended periods. Children were separated from mothers as soon as they could work. Adults were sold and resold, moved constantly to prevent the formation of supportive relationships that might lead to resistance. This constant displacement was deliberate psychological warfare designed to break down any sense of identity or community that might sustain hope of escape or rebellion. Women who might have maintained their cultural traditions, their languages, or their religious beliefs when kept in stable communities found it impossible to preserve anything when they were constantly uprooted and moved among strangers. Yet despite the overwhelming odds against them, some women found ways to resist. The historical record contains scattered accounts of poisonings, arsons, and coordinated escape attempts that suggest enslaved women never completely accepted their fate. These acts of resistance were almost always discovered and punished with spectacular brutality, designed to discourage others from similar attempts. But they continued to occur, which suggests that even under the most oppressive conditions, the human spirit retained some capacity for defiance. The infrastructure required to support this massive human trafficking operation reveals just how central it had become to Viking society and economics. Major trading centres like Dublin operated year-round slave markets that rivaled Rome's ancient forums in both scale and sophistication. These weren't temporary holding areas thrown together for seasonal raids. They were permanent commercial facilities with specialized architecture designed specifically for processing human cargo. Archaeological excavations reveal stone-lined pens that could hold hundreds of people simultaneously, drainage systems to manage waste from overcrowded conditions, and separate areas for sorting captives by age, gender, and apparent health. The logistics alone required extraordinary organizational capabilities. Ships arriving from raids across Ireland, Scotland, and northern England needed immediate processing facilities to evaluate their human cargo before spoilage reduced market value. Women who had survived the ocean crossing in cramped, unsanitary conditions often arrived sick, injured, or psychologically broken. The markets developed systematic procedures for nursing valuable captives back to minimum health standards while disposing of those too damaged to generate profit. Professional slave traders emerged as a distinct merchant class with specialized knowledge of international demand patterns. They understood that Byzantine markets preferred educated women who could serve as scribes or tutors in wealthy households. Islamic territories paid premium prices for young women with pale skin and light hair who would seem exotic in Middle Eastern harems. Icelandic settlements needed sturdy women capable of surviving harsh winters while performing agricultural labor and textile production. These traders developed sophisticated evaluation techniques that allowed them to assess a woman's potential market value within minutes of inspection. They could estimate age by examining teeth and hands. They could determine work capacity by observing posture and muscle development. They could identify pregnancy, previous childbirth, and signs of disease that might affect pricing. Most disturbing of all, they developed methods for testing virginity that increased market value while inflicting additional trauma on their victims. The pricing structures that evolved reveal the complete commodification of human beings according to market demand. A healthy woman between 14 and 25 commanded top prices, with virgin status adding significant premiums. Specialized skills like literacy, weaving, or medical knowledge could double or triple base values. Pregnancy might increase prices for buyers seeking proven fertility, or decrease them for those wanting immediate labor capacity. Women over 35 faced dramatically reduced values unless they possessed exceptional abilities. Those showing signs of previous hard labor, disease, or psychological trauma found themselves relegated to agricultural work, where their remaining productive capacity would be extracted until complete physical breakdown occurred. The elderly and seriously disabled were often killed immediately rather than wasted resources that could be applied to more profitable inventory. The international scope of these trading networks stretched from Greenland to Constantinople, creating supply chains that moved human cargo thousands of miles from capture points to final destinations. Women seized from Irish monasteries might find themselves in Icelandic farmsteads within months. Scottish girls captured from Highland villages could end up in Byzantine palaces after journeys lasting over a year. Slavic women taken from Eastern European settlements were transported down Russian rivers to markets in Baghdad, where they disappeared into wealthy merchant households. Each stage of these journeys involved new traumas as captives passed through different hands, different cultures, and different forms of exploitation. Language barriers made communication impossible, preventing women from understanding commands or expressing basic needs. Climate changes from northern European conditions to Mediterranean or Middle Eastern environments created additional physical stresses for bodies already weakened by captivity and abuse. The mortality rates during transport were staggering, but considered acceptable losses within the overall economic framework. Traders calculated that losing 30 to 40% of their human cargo during long-distance journeys still generated substantial profits from survivors who reached premium markets. Dead captives were simply thrown overboard or left beside roads like any other spoiled merchandise. Women who survived to reach final destinations faced the horrifying reality that their ordeal was just beginning. Purchase by individual owners meant entering systems of personal bondage that could last decades. Unlike the temporary horror of capture and transport, ownership meant permanent subjugation to masters who possessed absolute legal authority over every aspect of their existence. The adaptation required to survive in these circumstances created psychological transformations that were themselves forms of death. Women learned to suppress every natural emotional response to violation and brutality. They developed dissociative techniques that allowed their minds to retreat from physical experiences too traumatic to process consciously. They mastered the performance of submission so complete that resistance became literally unthinkable. Yet even under these conditions, some women found ways to preserve fragments of their former identities. They taught their children words from homeland languages disguised as lullabies. They maintained secret religious practices hidden within daily routines. They created covert networks of communication with other enslaved women that allowed information and small forms of mutual support to flow through households and communities. The children born into these circumstances faced their own unique forms of psychological destruction. They grew up watching their mothers violated routinely while being powerless to intervene or protect. They learned that their own futures held identical fates, regardless of any talents, dreams, or aspirations they might develop. They internalized their status as property so completely that freedom became not just impossible, but incomprehensible. Some mothers attempted to spare their children this fate through infanticide, killing newborns rather than condemning them to inherited bondage. Norse law treated such acts as property destruction, requiring financial compensation to owners, not as desperate attempts by mothers to show mercy to their offspring. The sagas occasionally mention finding dead infants, hidden in storage areas or weighted in streams. Their mothers choosing grief over watching another generation enslaved. The genetic evidence of this systematic abduction persists in modern populations across northern Europe. DNA studies reveal that Viking expansion wasn't primarily driven by migration of families seeking new lands, but by military expeditions that captured local women for forced reproduction. The demographic patterns show overwhelmingly male Scandinavian lineage, paired with overwhelmingly female Celtic and Slavic lineage in areas of Viking settlement. These genetic markers represent hundreds of thousands of individual tragedies, women whose bodies became unwilling vessels for cultural conquest. Their descendants carry DNA that tells stories their ancestors were forbidden to speak, evidence of violence that written histories tried to erase or romanticize as voluntary cultural exchange. The economic impact of human trafficking on Viking expansion cannot be overstated. The wealth generated from selling women funded the construction of longships, the purchase of weapons and armor, and the establishment of settlements in previously uninhabitable territories like Iceland and Greenland. Without profits from human commerce, Viking expeditions to North America would have been financially impossible. This means that every celebrated achievement of Viking civilization was built on foundations of systematic female suffering. The exploration of new territories, the establishment of trade networks, the creation of literary traditions, and the development of legal systems all depended on wealth extracted from women's bodies through violence and exploitation. The technology innovations Vikings developed for human trafficking would later influence other forms of commerce and exploration. The ship designs optimized for carrying human cargo informed vessel construction for centuries. The organizational techniques for managing large numbers of captives provided templates for military logistics. The financial instruments created for slave trading became models for international commerce. Most disturbing of all, the legal and cultural frameworks that normalized human trafficking established precedents that influenced European attitudes towards slavery for generations. The concept that certain categories of people existed naturally as property, rather than persons, provided intellectual justification for later systems of bondage that would devastate Africa and the Americas. The deliberate erasure of women's voices from historical records means that we know Viking slavery primarily through the perspectives of perpetrators rather than victims. The sagas celebrate warrior culture, while treating enslaved women as background figures whose suffering was too mundane to merit detailed description. Archaeological evidence provides some insight into living conditions and mortality rates, but cannot recover the individual experiences of terror, grief, and resistance that defined these women's lives. This silence in the historical record was intentional, designed to preserve Viking reputation while hiding the systematic brutality that funded their achievements. The chroniclers who recorded Viking achievements had no interest in preserving the voices of their victims. Women who might have left detailed accounts of their experiences were deliberately excluded from literacy, prevented from learning the skills that would have allowed them to document their suffering for future generations. The few glimpses we have of their perspectives come through accidental mentions in legal disputes, brief references in religious texts, or archaeological evidence that speaks louder than any written testimony. What these fragments reveal is a level of systematic dehumanization that went far beyond simple economic exploitation. Viking society didn't just profit from enslaving women, it required their complete psychological destruction to function properly. The legal codes, the religious justifications, and the social customs all worked together to ensure that enslaved women couldn't maintain any sense of themselves as human beings, deserving of dignity or consideration. The process began immediately upon capture, when women were stripped of their names and given new designations that reflected their function rather than their identity. A woman who had been known as Bridget in her Irish village became simply the weaver or the cook in her Viking household. Her personal history, her relationships, her individual characteristics were erased as thoroughly as if she had never existed. This wasn't accidental oversight, but deliberate policy designed to break psychological connections to former lives that might sustain hope of return or rescue. The physical markers of slavery were equally systematic. Enslaved women had their hair cut in distinctive patterns that immediately identified their status to anyone who saw them. They wore specific types of clothing that marked them as property rather than people. Some were branded with hot irons that left permanent scars indicating which household owned them. Others wore iron collars that couldn't be removed without special tools, ensuring that escape attempts would be immediately obvious to anyone they encountered. These visual identifiers served multiple purposes beyond simple identification. They created constant psychological pressure by making enslaved status impossible to forget or ignore, even momentarily. They prevented any possibility of blending into free populations during escape attempts. Most importantly, they trained free members of Viking society to see enslaved women as fundamentally different from themselves, making compassion or empathy seem inappropriate and unnatural. The daily routines imposed on enslaved women were designed to maximize both productivity and psychological control. Work began before dawn and continued until well after sunset, with rest periods calculated to maintain just enough physical strength for continued labor without allowing time for planning resistance or developing relationships with other slaves. The workload was deliberately impossible to complete perfectly, ensuring that punishment would be routine regardless of effort or skill level. Food allocation followed similar principles of calculated deprivation. Women received just enough nutrition to prevent immediate collapse while maintaining chronic weakness that made rebellion physically impossible. The constant hunger created competition among slaves for scraps and small privileges, undermining solidarity that might lead to coordinated resistance. Malnutrition also served the practical purpose of reducing fertility among older slaves, while ensuring that any children born would be small and weak, easier to control as they grew. Sleep deprivation was another tool of psychological warfare. Enslaved women were housed in overcrowded conditions where rest was nearly impossible. They were awakened frequently during the night for various duties, preventing the deep sleep necessary for mental and physical recovery. This chronic exhaustion created a state of confused compliance where complex planning became impossible and immediate survival consumed all available mental energy. The sexual violence that characterized Viking slavery wasn't random brutality, but carefully orchestrated psychological destruction. Masters would force enslaved women to service not just themselves, but their male relatives, guests, and allies as demonstrations of hospitality and power. These violations occurred publicly, witnessed by other slaves who understood they faced identical treatment. The humiliation was as important as the physical assault, designed to destroy any remaining sense of personal dignity or self-worth. Even more devastating was the systematic use of enslaved women's own children as tools of control. Mothers knew that resistance would result in their children facing immediate punishment, creating impossible choices between protecting themselves and protecting their offspring. Masters would deliberately separate mothers from children just long enough to establish terror, then reunite them as rewards for compliance. This psychological manipulation proved more effective than physical restraints in preventing escape attempts. The breeding programs established in larger Viking households reveal the complete commodification of female reproductive capacity. Women were paired with specific men according to calculations designed to produce children with desired characteristics. Height, strength, intelligence, and even eye color were factors in determining which enslaved women would be forced to bear children with which men. The resulting offspring were evaluated like livestock, with those showing promise kept for household use and others sold to generate additional income. Pregnancy brought no relief from labor demands or physical abuse. Enslaved women worked at full capacity until the moment of delivery, then returned to duties within days of giving birth. Infant mortality rates among slaves exceeded 60%, but this was considered acceptable wastage within the overall economic framework. The women who survived multiple pregnancies often suffered permanent physical damage that reduced their work capacity, leading to reassignment to less valuable duties or disposal through sale to agricultural operations, where remaining productivity could be extracted before death. The psychological impact of watching their own children grow up in slavery created forms of mental anguish that went beyond individual suffering. Mothers had to witness their daughters facing the same violations they had endured while being powerless to prevent or comfort them. They watched their sons internalize the same attitudes toward enslaved women that their masters displayed, understanding that survival for their male children required adopting the very mindset that had destroyed their own lives. Some women attempted to maintain sanity through elaborate internal fantasy lives, where they imagined their former homes, their lost families, or imaginary futures where freedom might be possible. Others developed forms of selective amnesia that allowed them to forget their lives before captivity, reducing the psychological pain of comparison between past dignity and present degradation. A few achieved complete dissociation, continuing to function physically while their consciousness retreated to places their masters couldn't reach. The religious dimensions of Viking slavery added spiritual torment to physical and psychological abuse. Christian women were forced to participate in Norse religious ceremonies that they believed would damn their souls. They watched their children raised in pagan traditions that contradicted everything they had been taught about salvation and moral behavior. Some maintained secret Christian practices, teaching their children prayers and biblical stories disguised as songs or games. But the constant fear of discovery added another layer of stress to already unbearable circumstances. The economic calculations that governed every aspect of enslaved women's lives treated their suffering as simply another cost of doing business. Masters kept detailed records of expenses for food, clothing, and housing balanced against productivity measurements and potential sale values. Women who became pregnant had their market worth recalculated based on expected delivery dates and the additional value of their offspring. Those who showed signs of illness or injury were evaluated for potential medical treatment costs weighed against replacement expenses. These accounting practices reveal the complete reduction of human beings to mathematical formulas designed to maximize profit extraction. A woman's pain, fear, or grief were irrelevant, except as they might affect her productivity or market value. Her hopes, dreams, or talents were meaningless, unless they could be exploited for economic gain. Her relationships with her children, her memories of freedom, or her spiritual beliefs were obstacles to be eliminated, rather than aspects of humanity deserving respect or consideration. The international scope of Viking trafficking networks meant that women faced the additional trauma of complete cultural displacement. Those sold to distant markets found themselves in societies where they couldn't understand the language, the customs, or the expectations placed upon them. The familiar foods, climate, and social rhythms of their homelands were replaced by alien environments that provided no comfort or stability. This cultural isolation intensified their psychological dependence on their captors, who became their only source of information about how to survive in their new circumstances. The medical treatment available to enslaved women reveals another dimension of their commodification. Masters provided health care only when necessary to preserve economic value, not to alleviate suffering or improve quality of life. Serious injuries or illnesses that threatened productivity received attention, but chronic pain, depression, or other conditions that didn't reduce work capacity were ignored. Childbirth complications were treated only if they threatened the mother's survival and future breeding potential. The legal protections extended to enslaved women were non-existent, creating a parallel universe where the most basic human rights simply didn't apply. Free members of Viking society could rape, assault, or kill enslaved women without facing any legal consequences beyond potential compensation to their owners for property damage. This legal invisibility meant that enslaved women lived in constant terror, not just of their masters, but of any free person they encountered. who could abuse them with complete impunity. The inheritance laws governing enslaved women created additional layers of terror by ensuring that death of a master didn't bring freedom, but simply transfer to new ownership. Women might find themselves passed to sons, brothers, or other male relatives of their deceased masters, facing the prospect of learning new preferences, new rules, and new forms of violation. Some were sold immediately upon their master's death to generate cash for inheritance settlements, meaning that even long-term adaptation to specific circumstances provided no security or stability. The documentation that exists of Viking slavery comes primarily from the perspective of perpetrators rather than victims, creating a historical record that systematically minimizes the suffering involved while celebrating the wealth and power it generated. The sagas treat enslaved women as background figures whose primary function was to demonstrate their master's prosperity and social status. Their individual experiences, their resistance efforts, and their human dignity were considered unworthy of detailed recording. This deliberate erasure from historical documentation was itself a form of violence designed to deny enslaved women any legacy beyond their economic function. Their stories, their voices, their perspectives on the events that shaped medieval Europe were systematically excluded from preservation, ensuring that future generations would remember Viking achievements while forgetting the human cost that made them possible. The archaeological evidence that has survived provides some insight into the material conditions of Viking slavery, but cannot recover the individual voices and experiences that would allow us to understand the full human impact of these systems. Excavated slave quarters reveal overcrowding, poor sanitation, and minimal comfort, but the fear, grief, and desperation that filled those spaces can only be imagined from the physical evidence they left behind. Modern genetic studies offer another form of evidence that speaks to the massive scale of Viking human trafficking. But DNA markers cannot convey the individual tragedies they represent or the generational trauma they created. Each statistical percentage represents thousands of women whose lives were destroyed by systematic violence disguised as economic opportunity and cultural expansion. The technological innovations that Vikings developed specifically for human trafficking reveal the deliberate and systematic nature of their operations. Ship designs were modified to maximize human cargo capacity while minimizing the resources needed to keep captives alive during transport. Specialized restraints were manufactured in standardized sizes to fit different categories of prisoners. Holding facilities were constructed with architectural features designed specifically for managing large numbers of unwilling occupants. These technical developments required significant investment and planning, demonstrating that human trafficking wasn't a casual byproduct of raiding, but a central economic activity that justified dedicated research and development efforts. The sophistication of Viking slavery infrastructure rivaled their achievements in shipbuilding, navigation, and metalworking, revealing where their priorities and resources were actually concentrated. The cultural impact of systematic slavery on Viking society extended far beyond the immediate economic benefits it provided. The normalization of female suffering as entertainment and the treatment of human dignity as a commodity created social attitudes that influenced every aspect of Norse culture. The casual violence toward enslaved women became a model for how power should be exercised and displayed, shaping relationships even among free members of society. The literature and art produced by Viking culture reflects these attitudes through its treatment of women as objects rather than subjects, its celebration of violence as proof of masculinity, and its complete absence of empathy for those suffering under Viking domination. The values embedded in these cultural productions influenced Scandinavian society for centuries, creating lasting attitudes toward gender, power, and human worth that extended far beyond the Viking Age itself. The resistance efforts mounted by enslaved women, despite their ultimate futility, reveal the persistence of human dignity even under the most oppressive circumstances imaginable. The poisonings, arsons, and escape attempts that punctuate the historical record demonstrate that Viking systems of control, however sophisticated, could never completely eliminate the human spirit's capacity for defiance and hope. These acts of resistance, though usually ending in brutal punishment for their perpetrators, created constant anxiety among Viking masters who could never be completely certain of their safety. Every meal might contain poison, every night might bring arson, every moment of relaxation might provide opportunity for revenge. The psychological warfare flowed both ways, with enslaved women finding ways to terrorize their captors even while remaining physically powerless to escape their circumstances. The long-term consequences of Viking human trafficking extended far beyond the immediate victims to influence European attitudes towards slavery, gender, and human worth for centuries afterward. The legal precedents, the economic models, and the cultural justifications developed during the Viking Age provided templates that would later be applied to other systems of human exploitation across different continents and time periods. The morning sun cast long shadows across the slave market at Hedeby as traders prepared for another day of human commerce. The year was 950, and what had once been a small Danish settlement had transformed into Northern Europe's most sophisticated centre for processing stolen lives. The infrastructure that supported this trade revealed just how central human trafficking had become to Viking civilization. Unlike the makeshift holding areas used during early raids, Hedeby's slave facilities represented decades of architectural refinement designed specifically for maximum efficiency in human processing. Stone-lined pens extended in orderly rows, each capable of housing 50 women in conditions that prioritized survival over comfort. Drainage channels carved into bedrock carried away waste from overcrowded enclosures. Separate areas allowed for sorting captives by age, ethnicity, and physical condition before presentation to buyers. The morning routine began before dawn, as guards moved through the pens with buckets of thin gruel and stale bread. The portions were calculated precisely, providing just enough nutrition to maintain basic health while ensuring chronic weakness that made rebellion impossible. Women who had arrived days or weeks earlier from raids across Ireland and Scotland huddled together for warmth, their bodies adapting to conditions that would have killed them quickly if implemented suddenly. Professional evaluators moved among the captives with the detached efficiency of livestock inspectors. They examined teeth to estimate age, felt muscles to assess work capacity, and checked for signs of disease that might affect market value. Their trained eyes could distinguish between a woman worth 20 marks of silver and one worth only 8 within moments of inspection. This expertise had been refined through years of experience, passed down from master traders to apprentices, learning the precise art of human commodification. The pricing structures that governed these transactions reflected decades of market research into international demand patterns. A healthy woman between 15 and 25 commanded premium prices, with specific ethnic characteristics, creating additional value in different markets. Irish women with red hair brought exceptional prices in Islamic territories, where such features seemed exotic and rare. Frankish women educated in Latin commanded high values from Byzantine buyers seeking household scribes and tutors. The documentation systems used to track human inventory rivaled those employed for precious metals or rare goods. Each woman received a number painted on her shoulder with dye that wouldn't fade for weeks. Records noted origin, approximate age, observable skills, and any physical defects that might affect pricing. These ledgers were maintained with obsessive precision, allowing traders to track profit margins and identify the most lucrative raiding targets for future operations. The international networks that moved human cargo from Scandinavian markets to final destinations stretched across known world trade routes. Women captured from Irish monasteries might find themselves transported through Russian river systems to markets in Constantinople within months of their initial enslavement. The logistics required for these operations exceeded the complexity of moving any other medieval commodity, requiring coordination between ship captains, overland guides, and local traders across dozens of different territories. The mortality calculations that governed long-distance transport revealed the complete reduction of human beings to economic formulas. Traders accepted that 30 to 40% of their human cargo would die during extended journeys, but the profits generated by survivors who reached premium markets more than compensated for these losses. Dead captives were disposed of like any other spoiled merchandise, their bodies thrown overboard or abandoned beside roads without ceremony or record. The specialized knowledge required for successful human trafficking created a distinct merchant class with expertise unavailable to casual raiders. These professionals understood which routes offered the best survival rates for different types of human cargo. They knew which seasons provided optimal conditions for transport and which political situations in distant territories might affect market demand. They maintained networks of contacts across multiple kingdoms who could provide updated information about pricing trends and buyer preferences. The training programs developed for newly enslaved women revealed another dimension of the systematic approach Vikings took toward human commodification. Women destined for wealthy households received instruction in basic phrases in multiple languages, proper posture for displaying their physical attributes, and elementary skills that might increase their market value. This preparation required weeks or months of specialized attention, representing significant investment in human merchandise before actual sale occurred. The psychological conditioning imposed during this preparation period was designed to create complete compliance through systematic destruction of personal identity. Women were forbidden to use their original names, forced to respond only to functional designations like weaver or cook that reflected their intended use rather than their humanity. They were punished severely for any attempt to maintain cultural practices, religious beliefs, or languages from their former lives. The breeding programs established at major trading centers demonstrated the long-term planning that characterized Viking human trafficking operations. Young women who showed signs of fertility were segregated into specialized facilities where their reproductive capacity could be maximized through controlled mating with selected male slaves. The children produced through these arrangements were evaluated like livestock, with those showing desirable characteristics retained for household use, and others sold to generate additional revenue. The medical knowledge applied to maintaining human inventory revealed the purely economic perspective Vikings took toward enslaved women's health and survival. Professional healers attached to major slave markets possessed detailed understanding of diseases that commonly affected captives during transport and holding periods. Their treatments focused exclusively on preserving market value rather than alleviating suffering, with painful but economically insignificant conditions receiving no attention whatsoever. The seasonal patterns that governed the slave trade reflected the agricultural and military cycles that shaped medieval European life. Spring brought fresh captives from early raiding expeditions targeting monasteries and isolated settlements. Summer saw peak activity as major Viking fleets returned from extended campaigns with hundreds of prisoners, requiring immediate processing and distribution. Autumn brought final sales before winter weather made sea transport impossible. The financial instruments developed specifically for human trafficking preceded similar innovations in other forms of medieval commerce by generations. Credit arrangements allowed buyers to purchase women with promises of future payment backed by property or future raiding profits. Insurance systems provided compensation for losses during transport, spreading risk among multiple investors. Partnership agreements pooled resources for large-scale purchases while distributing profits according to predetermined formulas. The legal frameworks that supported these commercial activities required extensive modification of traditional Germanic law to address the complexities of human property ownership. The resulting legal codes contained hundreds of provisions governing every conceivable aspect of slave ownership, from inheritance rights to compensation for damages. These laws were refined continuously over generations, creating increasingly sophisticated systems for protecting the property rights of slave owners while eliminating any legal recognition of enslaved people as human beings. The cultural celebrations that surrounded successful slave raids revealed how completely human trafficking had been integrated into Viking social identity. Communities welcomed returning raiders with festivals that displayed their human cargo as proof of military prowess and divine favor. The captives themselves were forced to participate in these celebrations, their visible misery serving as entertainment for free members of society who competed to demonstrate their superiority over defeated enemies. The religious ceremonies that incorporated enslaved women into Norse spiritual practices added divine sanction to systematic human exploitation. Priests declared that the gods favored Vikings with victory over their enemies, interpreting successful raids as evidence of cosmic approval for their actions. Enslaved women were forced to serve in religious rituals that celebrated their own subjugation, participating in ceremonies that thanked the gods for their capture and enslavement. The architectural developments that supported large-scale human trafficking influenced building techniques across Scandinavian society. The stone-cutting skills developed for constructing slave pens were applied to other projects. The drainage systems designed for waste management in overcrowded holding areas informed urban planning in growing Viking settlements. The security features created to prevent escapes influenced military fortification design. The technological innovations that emerged from human trafficking operations found applications in other areas of Viking civilization. Ships designed to carry human cargo efficiently were adapted for transporting other valuable goods across long distances. The restraint systems developed for controlling prisoners influenced metalworking techniques used in other crafts. The preservation methods that kept captives alive during extended journeys informed food storage and medical practices throughout Norse society. The educational systems that prepared enslaved women for sale created the medieval world's most comprehensive programs for rapid language acquisition and cultural adaptation. Women destined for international markets received intensive instruction in basic vocabulary, social customs, and practical skills relevant to their intended destinations. These teaching methods were later applied to training free Viking settlers for expansion into new territories. The intelligence networks that supported efficient raiding operations rivaled those maintained by medieval kingdoms for military and diplomatic purposes. Viking traders maintained detailed information about population centers, seasonal movement patterns, and defensive capabilities of potential targets across Europe. They understood agricultural cycles that determined when communities would have maximum numbers of people available for capture and minimum capacity for armed resistance. The supply chain management that coordinated human trafficking operations from initial capture to final sale required organizational skills that wouldn't be matched in other industries for centuries. Successful traders needed to balance inventory levels, transportation costs, market timing, and quality control across operations spanning multiple countries and cultures. The complexity of these calculations exceeded anything required for trading in conventional goods. The quality control standards applied to human merchandise revealed the sophisticated evaluation techniques Vikings developed for assessing human beings as economic assets. Professional inspectors could determine a woman's approximate age by examining toothwear patterns, estimate her work capacity by observing hand calluses and posture, and identify previous childbirth through physical examination. This expertise represented generations of accumulated knowledge about human physiology applied specifically to commercial evaluation. The market research that informed raiding decisions involved detailed analysis of international demand patterns and pricing trends. Viking traders understood that political instability in Byzantine territories might increase demand for household slaves, while abundant harvests in Islamic regions could reduce prices for agricultural workers. They adjusted their raiding targets and capture priorities based on these economic forecasts. The customer service practices that supported long-distance slave trading included guarantees about health, age, and skills that buyers could verify upon delivery. Traders who provided accurate information and healthy merchandise developed reputations that allowed them to charge premium prices and secure preferential treatment in competitive markets. Those who misrepresented their human goods found themselves excluded from profitable trading relationships. The inventory management systems that tracked human property through complex supply chains required record-keeping techniques that surpassed those used for any other medieval commodity. Traders maintained detailed logs of each woman's origin, physical characteristics, observable skills, and market value. These records allowed for precise calculation of profit margins and identification of the most lucrative sources for future raids. The transportation networks that moved human cargo across medieval Europe required coordination between multiple specialists with different expertise. Ship captains understood optimal conditions for carrying living cargo across dangerous seas. Overland guides knew routes that minimized exposure to hostile populations while maintaining access to food and water supplies. Local contacts provided information about political situations that might affect safe passage through different territories. The financing mechanisms that supported large-scale human trafficking operations attracted investment from wealthy Vikings who saw slave trading as an opportunity for extraordinary profits. Partnerships were formed specifically to fund major raiding expeditions, with investors providing ships, weapons, and supplies in exchange for predetermined shares of captured humans and other valuable goods. These financial arrangements spread risk while concentrating the expertise needed for successful operations. The insurance practices that protected investors against losses during risky human trafficking ventures preceded similar developments in other forms of medieval commerce. Policies covered deaths during transport, market price fluctuations, and political disruptions that might prevent successful sale of human cargo. Premium calculations took into account seasonal weather patterns, international political situations, and historical mortality rates for different transportation routes. The standardization efforts that created uniform practices across different Viking settlements ensured that human trafficking operations could function efficiently, regardless of local variations in culture or law. Common pricing structures, evaluation criteria, and documentation systems allowed traders to operate seamlessly across multiple territories. This standardization represented one of medieval Europe's earliest examples of industrial coordination across political boundaries. The training programs that prepared new participants in human trafficking operations transmitted specialized knowledge from experienced practitioners to newcomers entering the trade. Apprentice raiders learned techniques for identifying valuable targets, minimizing resistance during captures, and maintaining human cargo during transport. This systematic education ensured that expertise accumulated over generations would continue to improve operational efficiency. The research and development efforts that continuously improved human trafficking techniques represented ongoing investment in refining methods for extracting maximum value from human suffering. Innovations in ship design, restraint systems, holding facilities, and medical care all emerged from systematic efforts to reduce costs while increasing profits from enslaved human beings. The market analysis that guided strategic decisions about which populations to target reflected sophisticated understanding of demographic patterns and economic opportunities. Viking leaders studied agricultural cycles, religious calendars, and political situations to identify optimal timing for raids that would maximize human captures while minimizing military resistance. This intelligence gathering represented one of medieval Europe's most comprehensive systems for strategic planning and execution. The warehouse districts of Constantinople buzzed with activity as Byzantine merchants prepared for the arrival of another Viking slave convoy. The year was 987, and the great city that bridged Europe and Asia had become the eastern terminus for human cargo flowing down the Russian river systems. What awaited the surviving women from this journey represented the final transformation in their systematic dehumanization. The Byzantine slave markets operated with a sophistication that made even Hedabe's facilities seem primitive by comparison. Multi-story stone buildings housed specialized sections for different categories of human merchandise. The ground floor processed recent arrivals, providing basic medical attention to preserve investment value, while allowing buyers to inspect potential purchases. Upper levels contained holding areas designed for longer-term storage of premium captives, awaiting wealthy buyers who might take weeks to make purchasing decisions. The evaluation procedures used in Constantinople reflected centuries of refinement in human assessment techniques. Professional appraisers could determine a woman's educational background by observing her posture and hand position when presented with writing materials. They tested language comprehension through carefully designed conversations that revealed intellectual capacity without requiring lengthy examination periods. Most disturbingly, they had developed methods for assessing psychological resilience that helped predict which women would adapt to household service versus those likely to attempt suicide or violent resistance. The pricing structures that governed these transactions created multiple tiers of human value based on increasingly specific criteria. A literate Irish woman who could transcribe Greek manuscripts might command 60 marks of silver from wealthy households seeking educated servants. A Slavic woman trained in textile arts could bring 40 marks from merchants' wives needing skilled seamstresses. Even basic agricultural workers from Scotland or northern England found buyers among landowners expanding their rural estates. The cultural transformation imposed on women entering Byzantine service went far beyond simple language acquisition. New slaves received intensive instruction in Orthodox Christian practices, regardless of their previous religious beliefs. They learned complex household hierarchies that determined their relationships with other servants, family members, and visitors. They mastered elaborate codes of dress, gesture, and speech that marked their status while ensuring they could function effectively within sophisticated urban environments. The legal protections available to slaves in Byzantine territories created illusions of improvement that masked deeper forms of exploitation. While imperial law theoretically protected slaves from arbitrary killing or extreme physical abuse, these provisions served primarily to protect property values rather than acknowledge human dignity. Masters retained absolute authority over their slaves' bodies, labor, and reproduction, with legal remedies available only when violations affected other property owners' interests. The household integration processes used by wealthy Byzantine families revealed the psychological manipulation techniques that had evolved to maximize compliance from educated slaves. New arrivals were paired with established servants who served as mentors, teaching practical skills while modeling appropriate subservience. This system created artificial family structures that provided emotional support while reinforcing hierarchical relationships that benefited masters. The reproductive programs implemented in large Byzantine households demonstrated how slavery had evolved beyond simple labor extraction to encompass comprehensive control over human breeding. Female slaves were evaluated for fertility and matched with male servants according to calculations designed to produce children with desired characteristics. The resulting offspring were raised within household structures that prepared them for specific roles as adults, creating multi-generational systems of inherited bondage. The escape prevention measures employed in urban environments like Constantinople required different techniques than those used in rural Scandinavian settlements. Physical restraints were less practical in cities where slaves needed to move freely to perform household duties and conduct business for their masters. Instead, psychological controls became paramount, with elaborate systems of surveillance, punishment, and reward that made successful escape attempts nearly impossible. The documentation requirements for slave ownership in Byzantine territories created paper trails that followed human property through multiple transactions across decades. Bills of sale, transfer documents, and inheritance records preserved detailed information about individual slaves' histories, skills, and market values. These bureaucratic systems, while providing some protection against theft of human property, also created permanent records of systematic human exploitation. The medical care provided to valuable slaves in wealthy households reflected the same economic calculations that governed all aspects of their treatment. Expensive procedures might be authorized to preserve the health of highly skilled or particularly attractive women whose market value justified such investments. Common ailments that didn't threaten productivity received minimal attention, while conditions that might affect reproductive capacity warranted immediate intervention. The educational opportunities available to some enslaved women created complex psychological dynamics that intensified their suffering while increasing their economic value. Women taught to read Greek and Latin for household purposes, gained access to philosophical and religious texts that highlighted the contradictions between Christian teachings about human dignity and their actual treatment as property. This intellectual awakening often deepened despair rather than providing comfort or hope. The social hierarchies within large households created competition among slaves that served masters' interests by preventing unified resistance. Women who demonstrated exceptional loyalty or skill received privileges and responsibilities that separated them from newer arrivals. These elevated positions provided modest improvements in living conditions, while creating psychological investment in maintaining the systems that oppressed them. The religious instruction imposed on enslaved women often focused on biblical passages that seemed to justify their bondage while promising spiritual rewards for earthly suffering. Priests attached to wealthy households delivered sermons emphasizing obedience, humility, and acceptance of divinely ordained social positions. This spiritual manipulation added another layer to the comprehensive systems designed to eliminate hope of freedom or dignity. The cultural celebrations that incorporated enslaved women into Byzantine social life forced them to participate in their own display as symbols of their masters' wealth and sophistication. At dinner parties and religious festivals, beautifully dressed slaves served guests while demonstrating their owners' ability to afford such luxurious human accessories. Their obvious education and refinement made their bondage more impressive to observers who appreciated the cost and effort required to acquire such valuable property. The inheritance practices that governed the transfer of human property created additional trauma for enslaved women who had adapted to specific households over many years. Upon their master's death, they might be divided among heirs like any other valuable assets, separating them from the few relationships and familiar routines they had managed to establish. Some faced immediate sale to generate cash for estate settlements, beginning the adaptation process again with new owners who might have completely different expectations and requirements. The marriage negotiations that sometimes involved enslaved women revealed another dimension of their commodification within Byzantine society. Wealthy families occasionally arranged marriages between valuable slaves as rewards for exceptional service or as means of producing the next generation of household servants. These ceremonies mimicked free marriages, while reinforcing that even the most intimate human relationships existed at the pleasure and profit of property owners. The manumission procedures that theoretically allowed slaves to earn or purchase their freedom were structured to ensure that actual liberation remained extremely rare. The costs involved in buying one's freedom were calculated to exceed what most slaves could accumulate through decades of perfect service. Even when freedom was theoretically achieved, former slaves remained legally and economically dependent on their previous owners, creating pseudo-freedom that maintained many aspects of their previous bondage. The psychological adaptations required for long-term survival in Byzantine slavery created personality changes that represented forms of death even among women who maintained physical health. The constant performance of gratitude for basic necessities, the suppression of natural emotional responses to violation and degradation, and the cultivation of artificial affection for masters who controlled every aspect of their existence required fundamental alterations to human psychology that could never be completely reversed. The intelligence networks that connected enslaved women across different households provided the only form of mutual support available within systems designed to isolate and control them. Information about masters' habits, preferences, and weaknesses circulated through markets, religious gatherings, and chance encounters on errands. These communications allowed women to prepare for potential sale to new households while maintaining some sense of connection to others who shared their experiences. The resistance activities that occurred within Byzantine slavery took forms adapted to urban environments and sophisticated surveillance systems. Rather than the dramatic escapes or violent confrontations that characterized rural resistance, city slaves engaged in subtle sabotage, deliberate inefficiency, and carefully planned thefts that were difficult to detect or prove. These actions provided psychological relief while rarely achieving meaningful improvement in their circumstances. The cultural preservation efforts undertaken by some enslaved women involved teaching their children fragments of homeland languages, customs, and religious practices disguised as games or songs. These activities required extraordinary caution, since discovery would result in severe punishment, but they represented attempts to maintain some connection to identities that had existed before enslavement. The knowledge preserved through these efforts often survived for generations, creating hidden cultural continuities within families born into bondage. The economic impact of skilled slave labor on Byzantine urban development cannot be overstated. The availability of educated women capable of managing complex household operations, maintaining correspondence in multiple languages, and supervising other servants allowed wealthy families to engage in increasingly sophisticated commercial and political activities. The accumulated human capital represented by thousands of enslaved women contributed significantly to the empire's administrative and economic capabilities. The technological innovations that emerged from managing large populations of urban slaves influenced architectural design, security systems, and administrative procedures throughout Byzantine society. Buildings were constructed with specialized quarters that housed servants while maintaining appropriate separation from family areas. Document management systems tracked human property alongside other valuable assets. Communication networks coordinated the activities of slaves working in different locations for the same masters. The international connections that linked Byzantine slave ownership to broader patterns of human trafficking created demand that influenced raiding activities across northern Europe for generations. Wealthy Constantinople households' preferences for specific types of enslaved women affected which populations Vikings targeted and how they prepared human cargo for Eastern markets. These feedback loops between supply and demand created systematic targeting of particular communities based on their perceived value to distant buyers. The legal precedents established through Byzantine slave law influenced attitudes toward human bondage across medieval Europe and beyond. The sophisticated frameworks that balance property rights with imperial authority provided models for later systems of slavery that would devastate other continents. The bureaucratic procedures that tracked human property through complex commercial transactions established administrative techniques that would be refined and expanded in subsequent centuries. The cultural productions that emerged from Byzantine civilization during this period reflect the normalization of human bondage within sophisticated urban societies. Art, literature, and religious texts from the era treat slavery as natural and divinely sanctioned while celebrating the refinement and luxury that enslaved labor made possible. These cultural artifacts influenced European attitudes toward human dignity and social hierarchy for centuries beyond the immediate period of Viking slave trading. The demographic changes that resulted from importing hundreds of thousands of enslaved women into Byzantine territories altered the genetic and cultural composition of urban populations in ways that persist in modern times. DNA studies reveal the lasting impact of systematic human trafficking on the ancestry of populations across southeastern Europe and Western Asia. These genetic markers represent individual tragedies that shaped entire civilizations through forced migration and reproduction. The economic calculations that justified the enormous investments required for long-distance human trafficking operations reveal the extraordinary profits that could be extracted from systematic exploitation of female captives. The costs of ships, Crews, supplies, and security for transporting human cargo from Scandinavia to Constantinople were offset many times over by the prices that educated or skilled women commanded in Eastern markets. These profit margins encouraged continued expansion of trafficking networks and refinement of capture techniques. The psychological warfare techniques that maintained control over enslaved populations in urban environments influenced broader approaches to social control and political authority throughout medieval society. The methods developed for breaking individual resistance while maintaining productive capacity informed practices used against other potentially rebellious populations. The expertise gained through managing unwilling human beings found applications in military campaigns, colonial administration, and domestic governance. The medical knowledge that accumulated through managing large populations of enslaved women contributed to broader understanding of human physiology, reproduction, and psychology during the medieval period. Practitioners who specialized in maintaining the health and productivity of human property developed expertise in nutrition, disease prevention, and mental health that influenced medical practice throughout Byzantine society. This knowledge, gained through systematic exploitation, informed healthcare approaches for free populations as well. The architectural innovations that supported urban slavery influenced building design across medieval Europe as similar systems were implemented in other regions. The specialized quarters, security features, and administrative spaces developed for managing enslaved households provided models for residential construction among wealthy families throughout the continent. These architectural elements became standard features of upper-class homes regardless of whether their owners actually kept slaves. The administrative systems that tracked human property through Byzantine bureaucracy established record-keeping procedures that influenced governmental and commercial practices for centuries. The detailed documentation required for slave ownership, transfer, and inheritance created standardized forms and filing systems that were later applied to other types of property and legal relationships. These bureaucratic innovations contributed to the development of more sophisticated governmental and commercial administration throughout the medieval world. D. The morning bells of Baghdad's Great Mosque echoed across the Tigris River as slave merchants prepared their human wares for another day of commerce. The year was 1034, and the Islamic world's appetite for pale-skinned women from the distant northern lands had created the most profitable terminus for Viking human trafficking operations. Here, in the markets that sprawled beyond the caliph's palace walls, the final chapter of systematic female exploitation reached its most refined and devastating form. The holding compounds that processed newly arrived women represented centuries of architectural evolution designed specifically for maximum efficiency in human merchandising. Unlike the crude stone pens of Hedeby or even the sophisticated facilities of Constantinople, Baghdad's slave quarters incorporated innovations drawn from managing human property across multiple climates and cultures. Covered courtyards provided protection from desert heat while allowing for proper inspection of merchandise. Underground chambers maintained cooler temperatures for valuable captives, requiring extended care before presentation to buyers. The cultural transformation imposed on European women entering Islamic households surpassed anything they had experienced during their long journey from freedom to final bondage. Beyond learning Arabic phrases and Islamic customs, they faced complete reconstruction of their identities according to religious and social frameworks that bore no resemblance to anything from their former lives. Christian women who had maintained secret prayers throughout years of captivity found even these internal refugees stripped away as they were forced to participate in Islamic religious observances that contradicted their deepest spiritual beliefs. The evaluation procedures used by Baghdad's slave merchants reflected generations of refinement in assessing female human property for specific purposes within Islamic society. Professional assessors could determine a woman's educational background through carefully designed tests that revealed intellectual capacity without requiring lengthy examination. They evaluated physical characteristics according to aesthetic preferences that varied among different classes of buyers, from merchants seeking household managers to wealthy officials requiring ornamental additions to their harems. The pricing structures that governed these final transactions created the most complex hierarchy of human value found anywhere in the medieval world. A young Irish woman with red hair and basic literacy might command 100 dinars from a merchant's household seeking an exotic servant. A mature Frankish woman with demonstrated skill in textile arts could bring 60 dinars from buyers needing practical household management. Even older Slavic women past their prime reproductive years found purchasers among agricultural estates requiring experienced supervisors for other enslaved workers. The harem systems that absorbed many female captives represented the ultimate evolution of systematic female subjugation disguised as luxury and privilege. Women who had survived the horrors of capture, transport, and multiple sales found themselves in environments that promised comfort and security while delivering more sophisticated forms of psychological control than anything they had previously encountered. The gilded cages of wealthy Islamic households provided material comfort while ensuring that escape remained impossible and resistance futile. The competitive dynamics that emerged among women confined together in harem settings created psychological warfare that served their captors' interests by preventing unified resistance efforts. New arrivals faced established hierarchies among existing captives, who competed for their master's attention and the privileges that came with favoritism. These artificial social structures channeled women's energy into internal conflicts rather than coordinated opposition to their shared bondage. The reproductive programs implemented within wealthy Islamic households demonstrated how slavery had evolved into comprehensive systems for controlling human breeding across multiple generations. Female captives were evaluated for fertility and paired with other slaves according to calculations designed to produce children with characteristics valued by their owners. The offspring of these forced unions inherited their mother's enslaved status while being raised within household systems that prepared them for specific adult roles determined by their perceived genetic inheritance. The educational opportunities provided to some captives created cruel paradoxes that intensified psychological suffering while increasing economic value. Women taught to read Arabic for household record keeping gained access to Islamic texts that emphasized spiritual equality while being denied any practical application of such principles. This intellectual awakening often deepened despair rather than providing comfort, as literacy revealed the vast gap between religious teachings and lived reality. The medical care available to valuable female slaves reflected the same economic calculations that governed all aspects of their treatment, but with additional complications arising from Islamic legal and religious requirements. Expensive treatments might be authorized to preserve the health of particularly attractive or skilled women whose market value justified such investments. However, medical procedures that might affect reproductive capacity required careful consideration of religious law and masters' breeding intentions. The legal protections theoretically available to slaves under Islamic law created complex situations that often worsened rather than improved their circumstances. While Islamic jurisprudence contained provisions protecting slaves from extreme abuse, these laws were interpreted and applied by the same social systems that profited from their exploitation. Appeals for protection required slaves to testify against their owners in legal proceedings, where their word carried minimal weight compared to free men's testimony. The cultural celebrations that incorporated enslaved women into Islamic social life forced them to participate in displays of their master's wealth while maintaining religious and social customs that emphasized their inferior status. During festivals and family celebrations, beautifully dressed female slaves served guests while demonstrating their owners' prosperity and sophistication. Their obvious foreignness and exotic appearance made their bondage more impressive to observers who appreciated the expense and difficulty involved in acquiring such valuable human property. The marriage arrangements that sometimes involved enslaved women revealed another dimension of their commodification within Islamic society. Masters occasionally arranged marriages between valuable slaves as rewards for exceptional service or as means of producing the next generation of household servants. These ceremonies followed Islamic law, while reinforcing that even the most intimate human relationships existed entirely at the discretion and for the benefit of property owners. The manumission procedures established under Islamic law theoretically provided pathways to freedom that were more accessible than those available in Byzantine or European contexts. However, the practical implementation of these provisions ensured that actual liberation remained extraordinarily rare. The conditions required for earning freedom were structured to exceed what most slaves could achieve through decades of perfect service, while the legal and economic dependencies created by manumission meant that former slaves remained effectively bound to their previous owners. The psychological adaptations required for survival in Islamic slavery created personality changes that represented fundamental alterations to human identity. The constant performance of gratitude for basic necessities, the suppression of natural grief for lost homeland and family, and the cultivation of artificial devotion to masters who controlled every aspect of existence required internal transformations that could never be completely reversed, even if freedom was somehow achieved. The intelligence networks that connected enslaved women across different households provided crucial information about masters' preferences, household dynamics, and potential opportunities for small improvements in their circumstances. These communications occurred during market trips, religious gatherings, and brief encounters while running errands, creating informal support systems that helped women navigate the complexities of their bondage while maintaining some connection to others who shared their experiences. The resistance activities that occurred within Islamic slavery took forms carefully adapted to religious and cultural contexts that made direct confrontation impossible. Rather than dramatic escape attempts or violent resistance, enslaved women engaged in subtle sabotage, deliberate inefficiency in non-critical tasks, and carefully planned acts of theft or destruction that were difficult to detect or prove. These actions provided psychological relief while rarely achieving meaningful improvements in their material circumstances. The cultural preservation efforts undertaken by some enslaved mothers involved teaching their children fragments of European languages, customs, and religious practices disguised as games, songs, or stories. These activities required extraordinary caution, since discovery would result in severe punishment for both mothers and children. But they represented desperate attempts to maintain connections to identities that had existed before enslavement. The knowledge preserved through these efforts sometimes survived for generations, creating hidden cultural continuities within families born into Islamic bondage. The economic impact of skilled European slave labor on Islamic urban development contributed significantly to the administrative and commercial capabilities of major cities throughout the Muslim world. The availability of literate women capable of managing complex household operations, maintaining correspondence in multiple languages, and supervising other servants allowed wealthy families to engage in increasingly sophisticated business and political activities. The accumulated human capital represented by thousands of enslaved European women enhanced the economic and cultural development of Islamic civilization. The technological innovations that emerged from managing large populations of foreign slaves influenced architectural design, security systems, and administrative procedures throughout Islamic society. Buildings were constructed with specialized quarters that housed servants while maintaining appropriate separation according to Islamic law and social custom. Communication systems coordinated the activities of slaves working in different locations for the same masters. Record-keeping procedures tracked human property alongside other valuable assets with increasing sophistication. The international connections that linked Islamic slave ownership to Viking trafficking networks created demand patterns that influenced raiding activities across Northern Europe for centuries. The preferences of wealthy Middle Eastern households for specific types of European women affected which populations Vikings targeted and how they prepared human cargo for Eastern markets. These economic relationships created systematic targeting of particular communities based on their perceived value to distant buyers, who would never witness the violence required to supply their demands. The legal precedents established through Islamic slave law influenced attitudes toward human bondage across multiple continents, as Islamic expansion carried these frameworks to new territories. The sophisticated jurisprudence that balanced property rights with religious obligations provided models for later systems of slavery that would be implemented in Africa, Asia, and eventually the Americas. The administrative procedures that tracked human property through complex commercial transactions established bureaucratic techniques that would be refined and expanded over subsequent centuries. The cultural productions that emerged from Islamic civilization during this period reflect the normalization of European slavery within sophisticated urban societies that prided themselves on religious devotion and intellectual achievement. Literature, art, and religious commentaries from the era treat the enslavement of European women as natural and divinely sanctioned, while celebrating the refinement and luxury that their labor made possible. These cultural artifacts influenced attitudes toward human dignity and social hierarchy across the Islamic world and beyond. The demographic changes that resulted from importing hundreds of thousands of European women into Islamic territories altered the genetic and cultural composition of urban populations in ways that persist in modern times. DNA studies reveal the lasting impact of systematic human trafficking on the ancestry of populations across North Africa, the Middle East, and Central Asia. These genetic markers represent individual tragedies that shaped entire civilizations through forced migration and reproduction imposed through systematic violence. The economic calculations that justified the enormous investments required for transcontinental human trafficking operations reveal the extraordinary profits that could be extracted from systematic exploitation of European female captives. The costs of maintaining supply chains that moved human cargo from Scandinavia through Russia to Islamic markets were offset many times over by the prices that young, attractive, or skilled women commanded in Eastern territories. These profit margins encouraged continued expansion of trafficking networks and refinement of capture and transport techniques. The psychological warfare methods that maintained control over enslaved populations in Islamic environments influenced broader approaches to managing potentially rebellious populations throughout the Muslim world. The techniques developed for breaking individual resistance while maintaining productive capacity informed practices used against other conquered peoples. The expertise gained through managing unwilling human beings found applications in military campaigns, territorial expansion, and domestic governance across Islamic territories. The medical knowledge that accumulated through managing large populations of foreign slaves contributed to broader understanding of human physiology, reproduction, and mental health during the medieval period. Practitioners who specialized in maintaining the health and productivity of European slaves developed expertise in treating diseases, managing nutrition, and addressing psychological conditions that influenced medical practice throughout Islamic society. This knowledge, gained through systematic exploitation, informed healthcare approaches for free populations as well. The administrative systems that tracked human property through Islamic bureaucracies established record-keeping procedures that influenced governmental and commercial practices across the Muslim world. The detailed documentation required for slave ownership, transfer, and inheritance created standardized forms and procedures that were later applied to other types of property and legal relationships. These bureaucratic innovations contributed to the development of more sophisticated governmental administration throughout Islamic territories. The architectural innovations that supported Islamic slavery influenced building design across multiple continents, as similar systems were implemented in other regions under Muslim control. The specialized quarters, security features, and administrative spaces developed for managing enslaved households provided models for residential construction among wealthy families throughout Islamic territories. These architectural elements became standard features of upper-class homes regardless of specific regional variations in slavery practices. The educational systems that prepared enslaved European women for service in Islamic households created some of the medieval world's most intensive programs for cultural conversion and language acquisition. Women destined for household management received comprehensive instruction in Islamic law, Arabic literacy, and complex social protocols that governed interactions within wealthy families. These teaching methods were later applied to managing other conquered populations and converting them to Islamic cultural practices. The supply chain innovations that coordinated the movement of human cargo from Northern Europe to Middle Eastern markets established logistical frameworks that influenced trade in other commodities for centuries. The transportation networks, quality control standards, and financial instruments developed for human trafficking were adapted for moving precious goods, raw materials, and manufactured products across similar distances and cultural boundaries. The market research techniques that informed strategic decisions about which European populations to target reflected sophisticated understanding of international demand patterns and cultural preferences. Islamic traders maintained detailed knowledge about aesthetic standards, skill requirements, and behavioral expectations among different classes of buyers. This information guided Viking raiding priorities and influenced the selection criteria used during capture operations thousands of miles away from final markets. The quality control procedures that ensured human merchandise met buyer expectations required extensive knowledge of Islamic cultural norms and individual customer preferences. Professional assessors could evaluate European women's adaptability to Islamic household requirements, their potential for learning Arabic and Islamic customs, and their psychological resilience for long-term service in foreign cultural environments. This expertise represented generations of accumulated knowledge about human behavior and cultural adaptation. The customer service practices that supported long-distance slave trading included detailed guarantees about health, skills, and behavioral characteristics that buyers could verify after purchase. Traders who provided accurate assessments and healthy merchandise developed reputations that allowed them to charge premium prices and secure preferential access to the most valuable captives. Those who misrepresented their human goods found themselves excluded from profitable trading relationships with wealthy Islamic buyers. The inventory management systems that tracked European women through complex Middle Eastern distribution networks required record-keeping techniques that surpassed those used for any other medieval commodity. Traders maintained comprehensive databases of each woman's origin, physical characteristics, observable skills, psychological condition, and market value. These records allowed for precise calculation of profit margins and identification of the most lucrative sources for future acquisitions. The financing mechanisms that supported transcontinental human trafficking operations attracted investment from wealthy Islamic merchants who saw European slave trading as an opportunity for extraordinary returns. Investment partnerships were formed specifically to fund long-distance acquisition expeditions, with participants providing capital for transportation, security, and maintenance in exchange for predetermined shares of human cargo and profits from eventual sales. The insurance practices that protected investors against losses during risky transcontinental trafficking ventures established precedents for similar developments in other forms of international commerce. Policies covered deaths during transport, market price fluctuations, political disruptions that might prevent successful sales, and quality issues that might reduce expected returns on human investments. Premium calculations incorporated seasonal patterns, international political situations, and historical performance data for different transportation routes and supply sources. The standardization efforts that created uniform practices across different Islamic territories ensured that European slave trading could function efficiently regardless of local variations in law, culture, or administrative procedures. Common evaluation criteria, pricing structures, and documentation systems allowed traders to operate seamlessly across multiple political boundaries while maintaining consistent quality standards for human merchandise. The smoke from countless funeral pyres has long since dissipated into history's forgotten corners, but the truth remains carved into our very DNA. Every person of Northern European descent carries within their cells the genetic testimony of this systematic horror, markers that tell stories no saga dared preserve, evidence that written records tried desperately to erase. 500,000 women, 500,000 daughters, mothers, sisters, reduced to numbers in ledgers that recorded their sale like livestock transactions. Their names were stripped away, their voices silenced, their humanity denied so completely that we know them only through their absence from history. Yet they existed, they suffered, they resisted, and their blood flows through millions of living people who walk the earth today, unknowing inheritors of both victim and perpetrator alike. The Vikings we celebrate as bold explorers and fierce warriors built their achievements on foundations of female suffering so systematic it wouldn't be matched until the Atlantic slave trade, centuries later. Every longship in every museum once carried human cargo in its hold. Every artifact we admire was purchased with profits from trafficking women's bodies. Every settlement they established was populated through forced reproduction by enslaved mothers. This was not a footnote to Viking civilization. This was its economic engine, its foundation, its dark heart pumping blood money through every vein of Norse society. The wealth that funded their expeditions to North America, the networks that connected Greenland to Constantinople, the legal systems that became the basis for medieval European law, all of it built on the systematic destruction of female lives. Understanding this history matters because these patterns never truly disappear. They evolve, adapt, find new forms across different centuries and continents. The techniques Vikings perfected for breaking human resistance, the legal frameworks they created for erasing human dignity, the economic models they developed for profiting from human suffering, these became templates that would be refined and reapplied again and again throughout history. The women whose stories we've tried to recover deserve more than our horror at what they endured. They deserve recognition that their suffering was not random tragedy, but systematic exploitation that built the foundations of the world we inherited. They deserve acknowledgement that Viking achievement was not separate from female destruction, but entirely dependent upon it. Their silence was imposed by force, but we can choose to break that silence now. We can speak their forgotten names, honor their resistance, and refuse to let their suffering disappear into romanticized myths about noble warriors and glorious adventures. The genetic evidence persists. The archaeological truth remains buried in Scandinavian soil. The legal precedents still influence modern law. The cultural attitudes they shaped continue to echo through our societies. We cannot undo what was done, but we can finally see it clearly, speak it honestly, and ensure that these 500,000 women are remembered not as property in some Viking's inventory, but as human beings whose lives mattered, whose suffering was real, and whose legacy demands our recognition. They were not footnotes to history. They were its foundation, buried beneath centuries of deliberate forgetting. Today, we remember.